I'm Jonathan Romney, and I'm the film critic of The Independent on Sunday. I also write for Sight and Sound and various other places. And I guess I'm here because I've written about slow cinema in the past, and I've taken part in various arguments about slow cinema. One of the reasons I was here was to champion and to interview Fred Kelemen, to present his films and interview him, do Q&As with him. In fact, he could make it, but it's great to see the films again and talk about them, because I've been doing introductions to them on stage, and in fact I haven't seen them for a very long time, something like 15 years, so I'm working from memory and working from what I've been seeing in the films, having seen them for the first time in 15 years more or less, and seeing his extraordinary 3-something hour film Frost, which I had in my head that it was some kind of masterpiece, and in fact I haven't seen it since then. Seeing it now, that it's pretty much confirmed itself for me. It really is every bit as extraordinary as I thought it was. Okay. Yeah, it's an interesting grouping of filmmakers because, obviously they have certain things in common. They're interested in time, they're interested in pacing, duration, creating worlds. I mean, one of the things about slow films by nature and long films, but in fact, it doesn't really make any difference, because a film can be 80 minutes or something like Fred Kelemen's Fate, or it can be 8 hours like Love Diaz's Melancholia. Each film creates its own space, as it were, so it lasts as long as it lasts, and that's its kind of universe. Each one creates its own terms, the terms you watch it under, which is very different from the sort of films you would see at the multiplex, where you go and see a 2-hour film, there's something about the genre of, say, a rom-com or a melodrama or a thriller or an action movie. Each of those sort of established genres has its own habits of time, as it were. So exactly, when you go and see one of those films, exactly when you've been there for the right length of time. These films you don't know. These are films that kind of sketch out space in a particular way. They create the space, the world you enter into. They create the time you enter into. So each one is its own kind of capsule. It's a capsule of the world and a capsule of the experience that you undergo when you're watching it. And each one can be any length whatsoever. So in a sense, there's no difference between watching an 80-minute film and an 8-hour film, because each one is kind of self-sufficient and self-defining in those terms. It's as long as it needs to be. Slowness, in a way, is neither here nor there, slowness itself, but one of the things about these films is that each one defines its own space, and it kind of creates the terms you watch it under. And one of the important things about these films is seeing them in a cinema and actually coming in, turning off your mobile, forgetting what time it is, not really knowing when a film is going to end, and letting yourself be caught up in it. I know people very often talk about cinema as being, or art cinema particularly, as being a sort of spiritual experience, and one can get rather kind of churchy about it, but there is something very particular about the state of mind you get into. It's a different state of perception that you get into when you're watching a film by Bela Tarr, say, or Fred Kelemen, or Love Diaz. And watching a Love Diaz film is a completely different experience for me, because I didn't know anything about his films at all. Right now, as we're speaking, I'm 6 hours into the 8 hours of Melancholia, and it's a very, very different thing. It's very different from any of the other filmmakers we've been talking about, because it's quite narrative heavy. A lot happens, there are a lot of characters, and you keep having to ask yourself questions about who everyone is, where they've been, who they really are, where they're going. Characters have changed identity. The whole film, about 2 hours in, radically changed identity. That's a very different thing from the kind of cinema of Fred Kelemen, where everything is sort of pretty much on an even keel, but it starts with one event and then everything intensifies. Whereas Love Diaz keeps things on a kind of, things drift along, but they sort of zigzag. It's like sort of following a very kind of slowly moving river, but with violent detours all the way along. I haven't often been to events like this. I mean, I've been to some events which have been dedicated to one director, and what's interesting about an event like this dedicated to a particular kind of cinema, especially given that there are films here up to 8 hours, there may even be longer ones as far as I know, but it's interesting that everyone has seen the first 6 hours of this film. Everyone's outside finishing their dinner. There's a kind of community atmosphere that people are going through this experience together and talking about it. And I think clearly these films are being made to be lived through. I mean, I remember seeing Satan Tango on my TV at home. I think it was the second time I'd watched it. The first time was in the cinema, the second time was on tape. And because there was one other person in the room watching it with me, and we knew we were going through this experience together and, taking turns to go and get the coffee, it became a communal experience. And it's very different from watching something on your own. When I find I never really get caught up by a film if I'm watching it on TV by myself, but as long as one other person is there, you're going through it. And certainly there's something about this extraordinary venue which I think really is kind of incredibly well tuned to creating a community. It's a very interesting experience, and I think anyone who's watched 8 hours of a Love Diaz film together, they will have something in common. He talks about his faithful viewers as being warriors, so we're all warriors together.